Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? If you can't, let me know, because I'm a little tired and I have a cold, and you probably can hear it. And I'm a little frightened too. I've been on the road a while. Something happened to me on the road. I don't know if I can explain this to you, but something I like to try. Something that's never happened to me before. It involves memory. And I've been thinking about tonight, thinking about what I want to discuss with you and you with me, what strikes me as American loss of memory. But this is what happened to me one morning, not more than a week ago. I woke up in the hotel room where I was. By this time, you don't quite know where you are. Someone has to tell you. Hotel room is it? Which town is it? What time are they coming for you? Without that, you're really helpless. So I woke up and looked out of the window and thought, my God, they're going to be, let's say, in Duluth tonight. And the cab traveling with me informed me at some point in my hysteria that the gig that I was preparing to do tonight, I had done last night. You did that, Jimmy. Don't you remember? And I didn't remember. I don't remember until today. That means that at some point I got my clothes on, got in and out of the shower, got on stage, faced an audience, got off stage, came back home and went to sleep, presumably, and don't remember it. There's something frightening about that. What does it say? It frightens me, first of all, because one wouldn't like to think that one was quite that driven, because what it said to me was something about the level of fatigue which would permit you to do that, or the level of panic, or something yet more mysterious. The point is, however, that I did it, and my memory refuses to recover it. So very, 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 very dimly. It does mean then, certainly, not only fatigue, but a certain level of terror, because there's something terrifying about facing an audience. Same way there's something terrifying about getting on a plane. Everybody is very cool about getting on a plane, but everybody really knows that it's 30,000 feet in the air, and that's not a very comfortable feeling. In the same way, you face an audience, you got to be very cool about it, but if you got any sense, you know you're scared to death. So something like that happened. It made me think of other moments in my life and other people's lives. It made me wonder what most of the people I was watching or reacting to remembered. Sitting in the airport at Dallas, for example, just sitting there for maybe 15 minutes, half an hour between planes, can be a very instructive and very eerie experience. You are trapped, or it seemed to me that I was trapped, in a parody of itself. Those 10-gallon hats. And I don't know whether or not they were actually carrying pistols, packing pistols, but they seemed to be. They all looked and sounded as though they were doing a parody of a television show, possibly Dallas, which I have never seen. What were they remembering? What accounted for, this peculiar behavior, at once hostile and infantile, and these incredible costumes, which can't be very comfortable. In short, who are they? And what do they think they're doing? And what do they think they remember? And if they were only, this isolated airport, I've, of course, been all over this country by now. And in one way or another, what I'm talking about is part of what the country imagines itself to be about. And on the other hand, beneath that, really, beneath whatever this is, beneath this fiction or this loss of memory, there is another America, a real America, living and breathing and suffering and attempting to be heard, which no one ever talks about. The people who make up this other America, the real America, are not to be found in Time magazine, or, for the most part, on television, except as victims, or objects of pity. And when you think about it, we're talking, in a sense, aren't we, about two nations, or two potential nations, living on the same continent, in the same space, who, as far as the naked eye can see, have very different aspirations and very different realities. It is not unfair, I think, to suggest that what we would now call the official America suffers from a deliberate loss of memory. A deliberate loss of memory. It is very hard to know who, at this moment, represents the American people. It's very hard to know, in one way, just who the American people take themselves to be. I do think it worth some observation, some wonder, and perhaps leading to some responsibility. I think it is striking that as far as we know, as far as the world can see, a sovereign nation is represented by an untalented football player and an even more untalented actor. We get him through General Electric, and he was hosting that interesting theater. And various people discovered him, really, and put him to a certain use. Now, I say, who does he represent? The question is important, yet as concerns the man, it's not important. It's important as concerns the people of this country. Something like 96% of the black people voted against him, and not more than 52% of the American people voted at all. Which means we are in a certain kind of limbo there. Now, I grew up in a certain kind of limbo, if you like. My friend Omer is quite right when he says the world has changed a great deal, and yet it has certainly not changed enough. It has certainly not changed enough for any American or anyone else in the world to congratulate themselves on the changes which I have seen, for example, in 60 years. The French have a saying which translates as, the more it changes, the more it remains the same. What keeps one going, in a sense, is one's knowledge that things are always changing, whether or not you are always aware of it, and that things not only are always changing, but the effect of the change is never what you thought it would be, but in fact, the solution to every problem creates another problem. Every question, every answer hides a question. And that is really how the human race moves from one place to another. It is never, never done. Every question, every answer hides a question. And that is really how the human race moves from one place to another. It is never, never done. This led this commercial decision, because that is what it was, has led to untold horror. Because one of the results of that decision was that it had to be justified. It has to do with the lie told at the very beginning of the conquest of this country. It has to do with the fact that everybody who came through here opted to become white because, and I was not joking before, because I was black. And it's not so much, I wasn't black before I was discovered either. It's only after I was discovered that I became black, and I was discovered in order to make money for white people. That was the meaning of my discovery. And really nothing more than that. And it's interesting to note that the Americans described it as a European war. But by the time of 1939 and 1941, it was the Second World War. A very small part of the world. Madam Thatcher in England, though she is in the 20th century, thinks that she is really Queen Victoria and operates that way. And the British, for their part, seem to be so stunned, and who can blame them, that they don't know how to react to it. Yet they too are in the 20th century, and the 20th century has only got 15 years to run. It'll be over before most people have caught up with it. And we, in America, are not doing much better. And again, the loss of memory. We were talking this afternoon at lunch, various ones of us, about identity, really, including black identity, and the ways in which black people have changed, it seems to me, in many ways in the last 20 years, dating it roughly from the time of Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr. We have changed, but the country hasn't. And the ways in which we have changed endanger, how can I put this? To some extent, endanger, I was about to use a very dangerous word, our safety, but that was never a possibility, really. Our relations with other Americans. I think it is worth pointing out again, that one of the differences between the black American and the so-called white American, and when I say so-called white, I mean so-called white, and I'll tell you why in a moment. The people who settled this country were not white before they got here. Now this sounds like a very obvious thing to say, or to see, but given the loss or lapse of memory, which I was talking about earlier, it is something which probably has to be repeated over and over again for some time. Because it is something to do with my reading, anyway, of the American crisis. And it is a crisis. And this observation comes from a very simple thing. Something my father told me a long time ago. If you don't know where you come from, you don't really know who you are. And in the case of the Europeans, or the part of the world which calls itself white, which opted for being white, it's very serious because it has real results. The people who settled this country were all kinds of things, but they weren't white. They were Polish or they were Greek or they were whatever. But they weren't white. They weren't white until they got here. And more precisely, they weren't white until they met me here. Has serious results. It means that an Irishman and I, for example, can be friendly in Dublin, but not in Boston, where we can't speak to each other. And it's not an act of God. A Pole and I can be friendly with each other anywhere in the world except Chicago, where we can scarcely speak to each other, where we are enemies. Why? This country, watching it deal with me, it's how it started. I joked a little bit about the cowboys in Dallas, but they're not really a joke. And they really apparently believe the role they think they're playing. And a great deal of what is happening in this country now, not only in this country but in the Western world, is involved with a loss of memory, a failure to apprehend, to face what really happened, to bring the world to the place it finds itself. One might ask, for example, why was right and why has one not even questioned this, that a certain part of the world called Europe could describe a family quarrel, which is what it was, as a world war. But what strikes me again and again and again in trying to deal with my subjugation, it had to be justified, my castration. It had to be justified, the use of my labor for the cash crop, which kept me poor and made others rich. It had to be justified somehow. So that people who think of themselves or thought of themselves as white, being forced to think of me as black, had to invent all kinds of stratagems and fantasies and lies to justify my enslavement and their privilege. Now in this, obviously something happened to the slave. But there's a great difference between the slave and his master. A very great difference which no one ever wants to look at. The slave does not invent his master. He apprehends him. He endures him. He understands him. He has learned to outwit him because his life is in his master's hands. His life, his women's lives, his children's lives. So he cannot afford to fool himself about someone who holds over him the power of life or death. Not only over him, but over everything dear to him, the slave. But the master is in another condition, in that he has to invent the slave. He has absolutely no choice in the matter. He has to invent him in order to live with him and with himself. He has to invent the black Paul. He has to invent that. He has to invent the black mammy. He has to invent that. He has to invent the black man when he is young and is simply Tom and a sexual menace to the universe, and then when he is older and become presumably sexless, his Uncle Tom, whose only reason for existence is his devotion to white people. And now, if you believe I'm exaggerating, you examine the myths in America, not only in America, the myths in America and in England and in the Western world, but especially here, about black people. From the birth of a nation to Gone with the Wind to the Member of the Wedding, through Faulkner, through Carson McCullers, up to the present day. And ask yourselves why this is still so. I contend it is so because you paralyze yourself, the American people, were forced to do a moral kind of lobotomy on themselves. And this really means to destroy your sense of reality. When I was a little boy growing up in Harlem, watching my father, and then later watching the cops, watching my father's way with white people. My father was a Christian minister, which he wanted me to become. There were many terrifying things about my father, but one of the most terrifying things about him was the depth of his hatred of white people, who, for their part, didn't see that at all. They saw a perfectly pious, respectable black minister devoted to the Bible, to the Lord, and to the love of all mankind. It wasn't like that at all. He hated white people with all his heart, and in fact, his hatred of white people was so deep that it saved me from that, because it helped to kill my father. Hatred does kill. But where we are now involves a refusal. That's just the best way to look at it. I think two things. On the part of a great many people in this country, a refusal to look at the meaning of the 20th century, a refusal to look at the meaning of what is going on in South Africa, a refusal to look at the meaning of the social chaos threatening to overtake this country. Poverty has real results. I know, because I was raised in poverty. And when one segment of the population breaks the unspoken social contract with another segment of the population, everyone is in trouble. It is not possible for anyone in this room or in this country to be safe as long as I am not, to be free as long as my children are not. Now, this is true whether or not I say so, and whether or not anyone wishes to believe me. It is what has happened in every society, and it always will, because in fact, whether or not we like it, we are all connected. And we deny that at our peril. We deny that, and we risk death denying that. Here, very much like England in a way, instead of looking forward to what we have to deal with now and in the 15 years left to this century, what our real responsibilities are to our children, above all, we have turned our faces to the past and dug up someone who reminds you think, we think, of who? Teddy Roosevelt? The days when the frontier was open, when a man was a man. The days when you could kill an Indian, when he was an Indian. The days when America was really great. The days when America was really great when Uncas was quiet on the reservation and I was quiet in the cotton fields. Is this the past that we expect now to nourish this present? How can it be so deluded? As I suppose, first of all, that it is possible. It is never possible to return to the past, and especially if it's a past that was invented in the first place. What a black person knows, if he knows anything, when he survives, as he must survive, this peculiar system of, this peculiar labyrinth, unlike the bulk of white people. And this is something to do with the crisis we're passing through. A black person has to know where he or she comes from. That is the only way he or she can get through the midnight hour. We have a song that says, I was way down in the valley where I couldn't hear nobody pray. Everybody, one way or another, sooner or later, finds himself in that valley where I couldn't hear nobody pray. But a people geared to safety, born believing that they had a right to safety, and that safety was not only their right, but their province. Behind me, after all, when I found myself in trouble in my midnight hour or hours, I had, whether or not I liked it. I didn't always like it. I had my daddy and my mama, and all of what that implied, where that came from, which is where I came from, and the sorrow and the terror which overtakes every life in some moments, could somehow be withstood since others had prepared me for it, and I knew that in another way I was not alone, but I had a responsibility to the people who produced me. But it is a very, very different matter if when the child becomes a man, or as he, in the process, the child becoming a man or a woman. There's a moment when you have to examine everything, check everything out, when everything hurts you, and you got to find out what it is. And at that moment in your life, and it happens in everybody's life, whether or not you are willing to accept it, you have to have some kind of corroboration of who you are in order to know exactly where you are, in order to move from where you are to where you have to go. Nobody has ever done this alone. It is not possible. A certain day, a certain hour, a certain context. And this was happening around me, this was happening around me, this was happening around me when I was in the cradle. Because I was being formed by what was happening around me. They came from somewhere. A person born to danger, knowing it, has to learn to use it, since that is his element. And he has to know where he came from. I have to know that I was born in Harlem Hospital. Cannot imagine the danger of which I speak. And in my time, I've avoided it with every stratagem known to man. Chief among them, the witch doctor Americans call psychiatrist, who, that invention, had some appalling results. And one of the results of that invention was to destroy in a whole generation of so-called white people any moral sense at all. They were ordered to adjust to the society. They felt that they should adjust to it, and they did adjust to it. With the disastrous effects on their children whom they could not raise to know right from wrong. And you do not take my word for this, you check the record out. Where did the flower children come from? How did we get them? And the Weathermen, and the Manson family, to leave it at that. At a certain moment in your life, you must speak English, and your father only speaks Greek, and you can't talk to your father because you've got to become a guy named Joe and make it in the American mainstream. And you become nothing more than a guy named Joe. And you settle for what you think you're supposed to settle for. And one of the results of this series of choices is the danger of the present hour. Because one of the things that's happening in this country, there's a whole collection of people, very nice people too, not wicked at all, at least not willfully, but they do not know who they are. And one of the reasons they don't know who they are is because they had to invent me. I'm an invention in their minds, and it prevents them from dealing with reality. And why am I an invention in their minds? I represent everything Americans think that they are not. All of the danger, all of the sorrow, all of the sin, hell, and even death. That is what the American black man represents in the American psyche. And in the American psyche, I take the burden. I take the weight. I prove what it means to be white. I prove that it is important to be white. I prove that white people won't have to go through sin and death and hell because I am going through it for them. Now, that may sound simple-minded, but that is the history of this country and the actuality until today. And what we do about that, I do not know. The first thing we have to do is face it. Because on the other hand, I am not merely an invention of a disturbed psyche. I'm also an historical creation, with an historical validity. I am above all a human being, as uncontrollable, as unpredictable, as beautiful, as terrible, as awful, as all human beings are. I am committed not to a fantasy, but to the human race. And my connections do not begin or end in this place. The world, I hope before I die I don't ever have to say it again. But still, at this point in one's life, one has to keep saying, children, the world is not white. It has never been white. It is not white now, and it will not be white tomorrow. It was white only for a very brief period of time in the imaginations of a very small handful of people whose hour has come. There will be no more Chinese gunboats no British gunboats down the Chinese River. And Africa, allow me to inform you, is just about to be discovered. And it will not be exotic, this discovery this time. Where does that place us? I suggest that part of what is happening here has to do with the real relationship of the so-called white American to the so-called old world, or in other words, to his history. That white Americans, I'm suggesting, have made a myth of their relationship to the old world in order to avoid what it really means. There are people in this country dreaming of going home to Ireland, for example, to die, not to live. And vast amounts of money are sent to Israel every summer, or every year, every day, for all I know, by people who do not intend to go there. I have a great deal of difficulty getting any money at all to black South Africa. And there are reasons for that. And I'm as a black American citizen, in the fascinating position of watching my government try to destroy the dark government in Nicaragua in the name of freedom, while they can do nothing at all about freedom in South Africa. And after all, let's face it, kids, my mama didn't raise no fools. So we know what this means. We also have to know that we may be living through a moment and we have to seize this moment. We're living through a moment as important as that moment in Spain, immortalized by Picasso, when Guernica was bombed, the first civilian bombing in the history of the world. And Picasso and many others were bright enough to see what precedent this established. And every moment since Guernica, well, the civilian populations of the world have been a terrifying thing. Now the world allowed it to happen, which is how they get the Third Reich, and everything that comes after that. And we are at a very much same turning point now, with the same moral decision before us, the same impossibility, because it is perfectly true that no kingdom, no state, no power gives up power easily or deliberately. We may be doomed to learn again. I hope this is not to be so, but we may be doomed to learn again that people do not give things up. Things are taken away from them. But I think that in this country now, it being the only country in the world in which one can make such a demand, no way. And if the people, us now, do not understand this, then we have to go through something awful, and the world will go through something awful because of what we are trying to avoid. I am here to beg you to reconsider, because I know that we can be better than that. And that, as the Chinese say, the longest journey begins with a single step. Thank you.
Mr. Baldwin has agreed to entertain some questions from the floor. Do you want to recommend?
Yeah, well, you want to field it, should I?
You do.
Okay.
You talk a lot about the myth of essentially white supremacy and the struggle of blacks to get independence. I think you're seeing
As far as?
the struggle of black people to get independence in this country. Something we're seeing now is the struggle of gay and lesbian people to gain respect and rights, and to overcome the myth of the male supremacy. Well, if you have any thoughts on the similarities, please.
Well, he's brought up the sexual question of gay and lesbian rights, connecting it with the black liberation struggle, all the liberation struggles. And yeah, there's certainly a connection. There's not. You see that the connection in my mind is very clear to me because of the whole black prohibition is essentially a sexual question too. You know, it has everything to do with the so-called white Anglo-Saxon myth of sexual, sometimes inferiority, sometimes superiority. And in this, the whole question of sexual deviance becomes a red herring. It's one more way of keeping people in subjection, because in fact, when you get right down to it, nobody really knows who he or she is going to fall in love with. And the state doesn't really care. And the church doesn't really care. But they do care about this, that you should feel guilty about it. See what I mean? Yes, sir.
About 20 years ago, I read your book, The Fire the Next Time, and I liked it a lot. What do you think this fire is going to happen?
You want to know when I think the next fire is going to happen? Well, it's happening now. You know, it's happening in Johannesburg. And that's going to spread. I'm not a prophet, you know. But I do know one thing, that when the people have reached a certain point in protest, that is not quite the word I want, but in their struggle for their autonomy, there's nothing that will turn them back, you see? And though they're in trouble, the people who are trying to control or destroy them cannot possibly win. You see what I'm saying? So that's quite enough fire for the moment. The question is, how are we going to handle it? Yes, ma'am.
What is your response to the people who would like to see the books that perpetuate the myth of white supremacy, like Brer Rabbit, Uncle Remus stories, you know, to have them removed from the school? Do you think they should be, or do you think they have a place?
I would certainly not want to know about Brer Rabbit and Uncle Remus and those stories which are allegedly written to justify black subjugation and white supremacy. Actually, Brer Rabbit and Uncle Remus were written for that reason, but black people have outwitted that. In any case, it's a very dangerous precedent, you know, to remove a book for any reason whatever. And there's no reason to protect black people from anything, you know. And if my kid is going to read Brer Rabbit and Uncle Remus, I'll explain to him what it's about. You know, it's not important. It's only white people who believe those stories. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
You say that we whites have a long journey ahead of us to break through the myths that we've created. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on those who might have started making a first step. Who might they be? And what might these first steps be already?
You asked me a very difficult question. She wants to know what the white people are already taking the steps on a very long journey. I think immediately of a white woman I knew whom you don't know. I mean, a white woman I know and knew and still know, who was one of my teachers when I was growing up. And I hardly ever thought of her as white, actually. But she taught me, well, she taught me, for example, about the Spanish Civil War. She taught me about books. Took me to plays and movies. And helped me grow up, really. She was a kind of selfless lady. And I can't say I met an awful lot of people like that. But I can say this, that I met enough for me to be able to stand here. You know, and in that context, anyway, what I'm getting to is this. You don't really think about the person as white or black. You know, at that moment, that you know that she has curly hair or he has curly hair, you know, and you know that, but it doesn't have any meaning anymore. No. What it comes to, I suppose, is that the white people have to, I'm beginning to hate the word white people, but still, as long as a white person comes to me as a kind of missionary, you know, then it's sticky because I don't want to be saved. You know. We have to agree on what it is to be done and do it. You know, and we learned this. Many of us learned this during the civil rights movement, the so-called civil rights movement. When white kids, for one thing, learned too, then when they got on the freedom train with us, the blacks, that their own parents were going to treat them worse than the niggers, because the white kids should have known better, and was jeopardizing everything that his parents thought that they had worked to give him or her. And that had a devastating effect on the youth of this country too. A great deal goes on subterraneously, you know, beneath the surface of this country, and no one wants to face it. And that is one of the things that happened in the last generation. You see what I mean? It's going to be a rough journey, no matter how